Well, thank you for joining in with us today. Uh, Quick explanation, we had a little bit of technical difficulties on a Sunday morning. So just in case for those few people that may have been watching and lost it and want to keep track, we decided to go ahead and re-record our message for today. And part of the reason for that is that this is the beginning, the first message in a short series on surviving life. And so I'll be looking at different things like today's on inferiority, but I'll also be looking at things like discouragement and fear and dealing with stress and dealing with loss. Next week we'll be doing how to deal with loss. Dr. Robert Schuller wrote in one of his books that the deepest need of man is self-esteem or self-love. Uh, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, which I was required to read when my first year I went to college in psychology class, Dr. Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist, psychiatrist, and a prisoner of war during in Germany in one of the Jewish concentration camps, he wrote in his book, his premise is that the man's greatest need is to be needed. Now, whether you agree with these statements or not, I think we can all pretty much agree and admit that how we see ourselves is pretty important to our mental and our social health. In this message today, what I want to like to do is I want to explain a little bit about inferiority and inferior feelings, where they often come from, and then give some biblical examples, and then finally give a prescription to help us overcome the feelings of inferiority. King David wrote in the Psalm 139, he said, "You made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. How precious are your thoughts about me, O God. They cannot be numbered." That's Psalm 139, verses 13 through 17. Wow. When I read that and I realize just how God placed such care in creating each and every one of us to make us all special and all unique. And when I consider the billions of people that have been alive over the thousands of years, and every last one of us is unique in some way or another. Yeah, there may be a lot of similarities and we may have much of the same DNA and that sort of thing, but every individual person is a masterpiece on their own. A couple of decades ago, scientists estimated that it would take a computer that was a city block wide and a city block deep and 22 stories tall to do what the human mind is able to do. Now, I imagine today, because of the advancement in computer chips and processors, that it would be a smaller computer, but I still don't think even the best of the small computers can compete with the human mind that God has created. And despite this, many of us still suffer from feelings of inferiority. Let me give you some of the symptoms of inferiority, inferior feelings. First, you need constant validation. Somebody's always got to be building you up. Overly sensitive to other people's opinions. Next one, you put your own needs last, always thinking that everyone else is more important than you. You can't take constructive criticism. You crave flattery. It's one thing to have honest, honest compliments, but some people just crave to be flattered. Just tell me anything. Just find anything, true or not. And the inferior person with inferior struggles, they want to be flattered. You procrastinate often, and sometimes you withdraw from society. And another key symptom is you find fault with others. Sorry to say, and sorry to admit, I find myself suffering from some of these symptoms myself. Some years back, Deborah and I went to a fundraising dinner in a very fancy place in Bellevue, Washington. Sometimes I call it Belvoir. And while we were there was a lot of business owners there. The company that Deborah worked for was kind of one of the sponsors of this dinner. There were a lot of business people there. There were some professional athletes there. They actually were part of the speakers. And as we sat at a table with another group of people, they went around asking what each one of us did. And when they came to me, I just simply said, well, I sweep floors for a living. At the time, I was working in construction. I had lost my position as a pastor, had taken a job in construction, and pretty much I was a laborer. And what I did a lot was sweep floors. I was in a bad place. Uh, Fortunately, she snapped me out of it. Maybe I should say she slapped me out of it. She didn't really slap me, but she really snapped me out of that funk I was in. And we all hit it. I mean, there's times, sometimes it lasts a lifetime, sometimes it's just a short while. Uh, some things to know about inferiority. First of all, it's not related to intelligence. In fact, often people who are highly intelligent, have a high IQ, suffer as much or more than those of us who are less intelligent. Another thing about inferiority, it doesn't always show on the outside because people like to wear masks. They wear masks of superiority. They're always boisterous. They always act like they're on top of life, always doing great. They use sarcasm. Their critical attitude, to name a few, often cover up feelings of low self-worth. And it's also not unique to the non-Christian world. In fact, there are many Christians who often suffer more than even people who are not believers in God. Too often, we as Christians are made to feel that we're not spiritual enough. We don't pray enough. We don't have enough devotions. We don't use the right spiritual lingo. So we're oftentimes made to feel as if maybe we're less spiritual or less godly than others. And we begin to feel inferior to some of those really godly people around us, the spiritual ones. Something I'm discovering is that there's always going to be somebody who has more than me. Somebody who prays better. So there's better preachers. There's bigger churches. There's nicer houses. Though I will say this, nobody's got a better wife or a prettier wife than I do. And that list could go on, that we list of different things that people are always going to find somebody who has more money than you. Bill Gates for a while was the richest man in the world, and not too long after that, someone else took over as the richest man in the world. And then Jeff Bezos, he became the wealthiest man in the world. Something happened, different things, stocks go down, and the wealth changes a little bit, though these people are still tremendously wealthy. But there's always somebody that's got a little bit more than you, just a little bit more than me. I like the words of Eleanor Roosevelt when she said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your permission." Let me share, just take a look at 3 biblical examples, though I'm sure you could think of a lot more examples of people in the Bible that may or may not have suffered from inferior issues. The first one I want to look at his name is Moses. I'm sure you've heard of him. There was a movie about it. About what he did. In Exodus 3, we find here he is. He's a young man, at this point about 80 years old, and he felt inferior, and he was frightened, and most of it was because of past failures. When he was probably close to 40 years old, he murdered an Egyptian who was abusing one of the Hebrews. And whether he was banished or whether he just out of fear just left, here we find him now. He is out in the land of Midian, kind of out in the no man's land, raising 3 kids, working for his father-in-law as a shepherd. Hardly the job, you would think, of a former prince of Egypt. Call him a prince of Egypt because it was Pharaoh's daughter who adopted him, pulled him out of the bulrushes along the Nile River, and accepted him and took him in and raised him. 40 years now, he's been nurturing this failure, nurturing this mistake that he made. So when God spoke to him and said, Moses, and the story goes, I'm sure you're familiar with it. The story goes that he was up watching his sheep, and he looked in the distance and he saw a bush that was in flames, it was burning, and yet it was not consumed. So he thought to himself, I've got to go see what this is. And as he got closer, the voice of God spoke to him, told him, take off your shoes, for the ground you're on is holy ground. And then God gave him his mission. His mission was to go back to Egypt, the place that he had ran from, and demand that Pharaoh release the Hebrew children, to release all the Hebrew people. And he said, I'm sending you back to do this. And I think that the only words that Moses probably heard at that time was, I'm sending you. Didn't even listen to the point that God said, I would be with you. I will, even if you need someone, I'll send your brother Aaron will come and he'll go along with you. And at this point, Moses he starts to stutter and he starts to back off, and he's not being humble at this point. Humility, real humility, is knowing who you are and what your potential is. It's no more and it's no less. Inferiority is thinking less than you are and settling for less than what God made you for. And in this chapter, we hear Moses say, I can't do it. I can't even talk. He was playing that old, oh, I'm just a simple man. I can't do this. You're going to have to find somebody else to do it. And yet God took all the responsibility for making Moses who he was, and God was going to teach him what to say. Something we need to learn is that disabilities and past mistakes do not need to disqualify us from doing what God wants us to do. Let's take a look quick at a second candidate here. His name is Jeremiah. Now, we often think Jeremiah is a prophet, and in the Bible there are two books that he is given credit for. One is the book of Jeremiah, the next one's Lamentations. We often think of prophets as being some kind of spiritual superheroes that had no fear, and they never wrestled with what to do, and they always would automatically go and do exactly what God told them to do. And yet, if you listen to Jeremiah's response when God first calls him, Jeremiah responds to God and he says, Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I'm too young. He had all sorts of excuses. I can't speak. I'm too young. And 2 verses later, here's what God says to him. He says, do not be afraid. Don't be afraid of them, for I am with you and I will rescue you. You see, God knew exactly what the problem was. He could see easily that Jeremiah was intimidated by the people, probably the religious leaders. Too often, those who think that they are spiritual are critical of what they see, and what they see or what they perceive to be less spiritual than they are. So they decide that they need to critique that person, whatever it is, critique how they speak, critique what they say or how they say it. If they don't use the right spiritual language, if they don't dress exactly the way that they think you ought to dress as a believer and as a Christian. So they have to point that out to you, and they've got to criticize it. But we find here that God promises to give Jeremiah the words that he can speak. Now, our third candidate is a little different than the first two. His name is Amos. Amos is not well known today, and he maybe could have fit in my last series that I spoke on when I preached and taught on the lesser known heroes of the Bible. Amos not so well known today, maybe except for his famous cookies. Amos was not refined. He wasn't cultured like some of the other prophets, Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah. He wasn't even educated and had experience like Moses had. What he did was he had 2 jobs. He was a fig picker and he was a shepherd. As a fig picker, his hands would have been stained from the figs. He would be rough, calloused, unrefined. It took no formal education to do either of those jobs. And yet we find that he didn't seem to suffer from any inferiority problems, despite his lack of education and his lack of culture. I just wonder how many people disqualify themselves and are lost to God's service because they have the wrong confidence. They don't have self-confidence. They don't have the right credentials. Amos didn't have self-confidence. We find that he had confidence in God. He had God confidence. And he didn't allow the intimidation tactics of the high priest of his day to hinder him. Amos' eyes were on the Lord. So when he spoke, here's the things he would say. He would say, you say, as he spoke to some of the people, the leaders of Judah, Israel at that time. He said, you say, but God says. His secret was look to God, not to me and not to man. Amos didn't allow his humble origins to determine how he saw himself. He looked at the God who created him. Consider for a second how God views us. Jesus talks about the birds of the air and the sparrows, and when they fall, that God has every one of them numbered. And it says at one point that are not 5 sparrows bought for 2 pennies. He says, see the birds, are you not worth more than they? And then Paul writes in Ephesians, for we are his workmanship. We're God's creation. We're his masterpieces. And in Philippians, Paul writes, for I am confident of this very thing. He who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus. Consider yourself this. Consider yourself a masterpiece in progress. When a painter begins painting, they start with a plain background. I have a friend who's a painter. I graduated from high school with him, and I was just recently reading on one of his posts. He was showing some of his paintings that he's been working on. He showed one that he actually started working on years ago. And he started out by adding a background, which was kind of plain. Then he started adding more details. Then he added some more to it. And then he set that painting aside for a little while he did other things, worked on other paintings and other projects. But now he's brought it back, and now he's adding even more details. And as I saw the picture of it, I could see how much finer and what a better painting it's becoming because he's still working on it. He hasn't quit. And that's what God's doing to us. We are like his masterpiece. From the time we were in our mother's womb, he started working on that masterpiece. He started building it, creating it, knitting it together, as David said. And he continues to work on us throughout all of our life. Let me give you a prescription here for dealing with inferiority. I guess you'd call them the 4 R's of healing from inferiority. First one is realize. Realize that you were thoughtfully planned even before birth. Psalm 139:16 that I already read says, you saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. To me, I find comfort in knowing that there's nothing that's happened to me that surprised God. You know, back in 2012 when I had a massive brain aneurysm, that didn't surprise God. He knew about it. He knew even before that was going to happen, simply with no other reason, because God is timeless and he was already there. And everything that we're going to go through, he's already gone before us. He's already there because he's timeless. God made you and I just the way he desired us to be. You are a unique and special tool made for his pleasure and for his purpose. And his desire is for you. Second thing is remember that he is still working on you. Just like that masterpiece painting, he's not given up. He's still working on you. It's tempting to think that at birth, God, he created us. Okay, I can deal with that. God created every person. And then he just sat back and said, well, let me watch what happens from here. And yet that's not what he does. He continues to work on us. I like to recall this old song that I heard years and years ago at a camp in Maryland. A couple of young men from North Carolina, sang it. And I know my family, they find, oh, geez, so you could sing that again, Chet. Oh, my goodness. But to me, it's such basic, wonderful truth. And it's he's still working on me. He's still working on me to make me what I ought to be. It took him just a week to make the moon and the stars, the sun and the earth, and Jupiter and Mars. How loving and patient he must be, 'cause he's still working on me. Remember, he's still working on you. Number 3, refuse to compare yourself to others. The problem with that is that you'll always find someone who appears better than you. And you know what? That can lead to discouragement. You can always find that, you can do the other way around too. You can find others who you are better than, and that leads to satisfaction. And that can be just as dangerous if you're satisfied, not willing to improve. And then also respond correctly. This fourth one is respond. Respond correctly to your weaknesses and to your flaws. Change what you can, accept what you can't, and always pray about them all. View a scar not as a cross to bear, but as a diploma. I really like the story that Chuck Swindoll tells of a seminary classmate that he had. This classmate was born with a very large crimson birthmark across his face. It's called a port wine stain. And yet this man was remarkably undeterred by this seemingly negative feature. And he would go on, he would tell them that he claimed that his secret was his father. And as a small child, his dad told him that that must be where an angel kissed him so that he could see him anywhere he was. Think about that. Think about the impact that would have on that small child. You know, when you go to school and someone would maybe laugh at the mark or laugh at his scar, laugh at that stain across his face, and he could think, oh no, my dad tells me that's where an angel kissed me, so that my dad will always be able to see me. So that if he was in a choir, if he was in a group, in a crowd, anywhere, his dad would be able to pick him out right away. Kissed by an angel. So the question I would have, if you're struggling now with some inferior issues, inferior problems, which, let's face it, we all do from time to time, what's your kiss? Where has the angel kissed you? What's that special thing? Maybe it's a scar. Maybe it seems like a mark, a birthmark. Maybe it's something that happened to you in the past. Maybe it's someone abused you or someone did something horrible to you, has said horrible things about you. It can all be a kiss to help you grow and help you overcome things. Let's just pray. Father, I am so thankful that you're not done with any of us, that you're still working on all of us. You haven't just stepped back and let it go. Every day, every moment, every hour of our life, you're right here with us. For that person out there, the person listening, the person that hears my voice right now, I pray that you would speak to them, make yourself real to them, help them understand how much you care about them today, even if they're in the midst of a difficult situation or a difficult time. Pray for you. I pray that you would touch them. Pray your spirit would minister to them. I ask this all in Jesus' name.